Hello, my name is Marco Nievo and I'm the CSO of CTF Europe. I wanted to welcome you to this info masterclass and most especially thank you on behalf of all the patients for your interest in NF. Now, before we move on to the real stuff, I need to give you some instructions regarding the Q&A. You will be able to put down your questions by using the chat box during the masterclass. We would much prefer if you put down these questions in English. If you have trouble formulating your question in English, we could advise you to try to use online translators such as Google Translate before putting them down in the chat box. And if that is not possible for you, please do it in your own language, and we will do our best on our end to have it translated as best as we can into English. Enjoy your masterclass.
Good day, this is Shruti Garg and Andre Rietman presenting the next episode of the Infer meetings, and this one is about cognition and behavior. Shruti Garg is a child and adolescent psychiatrist in Manchester, Great Britain, and I will start this presentation. I'm Andre Rietman. I'm a neuropsychologist from the Erasmus Medical Center in Rotterdam, the Netherlands. And our next slide is our disclosure site, just to show that we have nothing to disclose. And if you just type in your browser neurofibromatosis type 1 without anything extra, this is what you find. And one of the things that really stands out is that the majority of hits concern the somatic, the physical symptoms of NF1. And of course, the diagnosis is made based on physical criteria, but especially in children, problems in learning and behavior are the most prominent and the most frequent problems. Well, in our talk, we will focus on the problems in learning or cognition and in behavior. And the first thing to present to start with is a patient that came to our NF1 outpatient clinic in Rotterdam. His history told us that he had an NF1 diagnosis when he was 18 months old. And in his childhood, from 6 years old, he moved from regular to special school. At primary school, both the diagnoses of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and autism spectrum disorder were made. And at this time, when he was 14 years old, he presented with his parent. And his parents had already dealt a long time with his behavioral problems successfully, but this had taken a lot of their energy and of the attention that their other children also needed. And the most prominent problems for the boy himself were chronic pain and fatigue for himself, which made it impossible for him to follow regular school or work days. And at the moment, he works about 3 hours each day. And after that, most of the days he is exhausted. We started with his psychological help with a neuropsychological evaluation, and we found that his intelligence was still average, and there were several problems in executive functioning. He had trouble starting with everyday tasks. It took really a long time to wake up and to get started every day. So planning was a problem, and switching from one task to another was an issue as well. And his psychological help consisted of supporting the parents in dealing with his behavioral problems and his organization problems, and also with the organization of the support systems around him. So together with school, we finally found a sheltered workplace after he finished school. And when he was 19, his parents found a place where he could live with daily coaching. So he's not really living and working independently, but he's doing quite well at the moment. But the start, as in most children, was with this cognitive evaluation, just to understand where a lot of the problems, such as fatigue, such as the frustration and the slowness of starting the day, to understand them and to facilitate parents and children themselves in learning how to deal with this. Next slide, please. Yeah. This is an overview of all the cognitive and behavioral problems we will find in NF1. So first, on the top, you see this lower IQ, which is a lower IQ on a group level. but still the IQ itself is normally distributed in the group, resulting in a really heterogeneous group, just as in the normal population. So also with people on the left side, on one side with intellectual disabilities, but twofold, two times the amount that we see in the general population. And in the other side, also people with a normal or high intelligence. And we find some cognitive problems, which we will deal with later on. And the second, the most prevalent problem you find at the bottom, which is ADHD, which is 10 times, the prevalence is 10 times bigger in NF1 almost, which also tells us something about NF1 as a cognitive problem. And in adults, we also see an increased prevalence of internalizing problems. So with anxiety, such as social anxiety, with lower mood or even depression, and also in some studies, more attempts to commit suicide. And in one study, dysthymia, so a problem with mood over a longer period of time, is the most frequent diagnosis in 1 in 5 adult patients. And finally, most research concerning autism spectrum disorders has been performed in children. And also here we find at least a 10-fold increase of the prevalence of autism. And all these factors together, they strongly impact on quality of life. And now we will move back and forth from fundamental research towards clinical research and clinical practice. We start with fundamental research cognition and move towards diagnosis and treatment of cognitive problems. And finally, we will address behavioral issues and treatment. And in this slide, you see the different levels of fundamental research in NF1 cognition and behavior. This fundamental research in NF1 is a close cooperation of fundamental and applied sciences, but of the fundamental sciences, neuroscience and genetics are important disciplines who consider the cause and the treatment of NF1. And this research was really accelerated after the discovery of the NF1 gene and its gene product, the protein neurofibromin. And mainly in research in mice, who also have NF1 for this particular research, they found the effects of a lack of this neurofibromin protein in the cells and in the structures of the central nervous system. And one of these cells are pyramidal cells, which you see on the picture. And one of the structures is the hippocampus, which is a structure involved in learning and memory in both the brains of mice and of men. And by doing experiments, behavioral and learning experiments with these same mice, they found the effects of the lack of neurofibromin on behavior and on learning. And also they could experiment with the effect of different kinds of treatments to see whether these effects of the lack of neurofibromin could be repaired. In this slide, you see on the right side neurofibromin, which is one of the proteins that regulates the activity of the REST protein. And REST can be activated or not, and it functions this way as a kind of a switch in several molecular processes. REST becomes active when a process called phosphorylation takes place and when GDP is replaced by GTP. And in NF1, a decreased amount of neurofibromin causes the REST pathway to be too active. And since this pathway is involved in regulating, inhibiting, and facilitating different processes downstream, this can have effects not only on the skin, but also on bone structure, on cell growth and differentiation. And this is where cognition comes in, also in plasticity, memory, and learning. This is a really busy slide with a lot of neurons, nerve cells, and the colored shapes are neurons and the rectangles present treatment options following from the knowledge we gained about the effect of NF1. And the question mark indicates that neuroscience is still trying to understand all the steps, the several steps that are necessary in this process. And we start on the left with the blue neuron. We see neurofibromin as one of the proteins that regulate REST, mainly to decrease the activity of REST. And when less neurofibromine is produced, RAS is too active in people with neurofibromatosis type 1. This may result in an excess of inhibition in the brain. And as you may know, this is modulated also by neurotransmitters, the chemical substances involved in transmission of information between nerve cells. And GABA is one of these neurotransmitters. This is an inhibitory one, and this is released in excess, which can alter the functioning of parts in the brain in a variety of tasks. And the green cell on the bottom, you see are pyramidal neurons again, which we can find in the hippocampus. And attention, learning, and memory are some of these tasks that are moderated with neurotransmitters such as GABA. In this figure, LTP, long-term potentiation, is a mechanism which is essential for brain plasticity and learning. And the red neuron on the right is another neuron, and another effect is of the lack of neurofibromine is that is the decrease of dopamine production. And dopamine is a different neurotransmitter which is involved in movement and in attention. Then we move towards the therapeutic options. First, the rectangle on the left. Therapeutic studies have been conducted to find ways to influence the functioning of the RAS protein. And from 2014 to 18, different centers did studies with statins, aiming at the decrease of the substance farnesyl, which in animal studies prevents RAS to attach to the cell wall and to become active. And currently, trials with MEK inhibitors are being performed, and they aim for the reduction of plexiform neurofibromas. But we do keep an eye on the effects of these trials on cognition as well. Unfortunately, these haven't been really clear, but fortunately, the effects on plexiform neurofibromatosis and on pain are clear. The next rectangle on the top tells us about another study, but a study that hasn't been published yet and has been based on preclinical studies. These studies aim to decrease the activation of interneurons through so-called HCN channels with the anti-epileptic drug lamotrigine. And we really hope to see the results of this trial very soon. And the gray box on the right tells us about the studies that have been done with stimulant medication. In most cases, that will be methylphenidate. And they looked on the effect on ADHD symptoms in NF1. And most studies do show a positive effect on these symptoms of inattention and possibly even on general cognition. Then we move to general cognition. In this slide, we talk about intelligence. And this is a really global measure for all over cognitive performance. The first thing, in a very large group of more than 500 children with NF1, we found that variability of intelligence is not different in NF1. So there's still a really big variation between the lower, mid-average and higher IQs. And as you may know, the mean of an IQ test is 100. So that's the population mean, and the standard deviation then is 15. So normally the range of average intelligence goes from 85 to 115 in the general population. But in NF1, the group average is not 100, but 87. And there was a big difference, and there was not a big difference between verbal and performance tasks, those who were around the same score. A study of David Goodman found a possible link between the missense genotype and the cognitive phenotype, but our study could not confirm a strong relation between genotype and the cognitive phenotype. The only strong relation we found was for people with a microdeletion who scored almost one extra standard deviation longer, so with an average IQ of 73. And because we cooperated with two other centers, we could also put some information together about monozygous twins and their scores on IQ tests. And the IQs of these people were very highly correlated, even higher than in the general population, which may show a very strong genetic effect on intelligence. Now more to the specific parts of the cognitive problems in NF1. You can see three groups of very frequent and often occurring problems in NF1, cognitive problems in NF1. And on the top, you find the same picture that Rianne Oostenbrink already showed in her presentation. On the left, you see the model that children need to copy. This is the Ray complex figure. And when children with NF1 copy this figure, they have a really hard time doing so. They score 1 standard deviation below average on this visual spatial task. But if they must draw it from memory after 20 to 30 minutes, they score 2 standard deviations below average, indicating that not only the drawing, but also the memorizing of this kind of information is extra hard for children with NF1. Another thing I want to take out from the very frequent row of functions are executive functions. These are a very broad range of higher cognitive functions, including inhibition, working memory, flexibility, and planning, such as was the case in the case study I showed you in the beginning. And quite recently, we saw some research about motor problems in NF1, and these appear to be perhaps even more prevalent than ADHD in NF1, and possibly we even may need to consider the diagnosis of developmental coordination disorder in NF1. All these problems together with possibly other predictors, they result in a broad range of learning deficits. We can't really say that are more reading or writing or arithmetic problems, because they are all more prevalent in NF1. One study said that almost more than half of the children had reading problems in a group of children with NF1, which is a really, really big amount and asked really our attention. And overlooking all the performance of children in the Netherlands, we found that only 15% of the children didn't receive any help or special education, which leaves us with 40 to 80% of the children having any kind of some kind of learning deficit. In the frequent role, I only wanted to mention ADHD. Again, we mainly find inattentive presentation, and what is really special in NF1 is that the prevalence in girls and boys is nearly the same, whereas in the general population we find 3 times more boys than girls in ADHD. Fatigue is also quite prevalent, and possibly more in adolescents and adults than in children, but and this is not only a physical problem in NF1, but also maybe a problem of the brain, since a large amount of energy of a person is also consumed by our brain. And then I switch to the last slide about these cognitive problems for me, which is about information processing. And here you find almost the same problems that I addressed in the former slide. And this diagram shows the process of information process from left to right. So if you look at the left, you find not very many sensory problems. There are also not very many visual problems, for instance, in NF1, unless when there is optic pathway glioma, obviously. But when we move to the right toward learning and towards the effect of learning in action, we find more and more problems in NF1. For instance, the learning problems, we find the attentional problems and the visual spatial memory problems. And in the performance, the action part, we find the executive, motor, speech, and language problems. And all these problems together, they result in these larger problems we already mentioned, such as sleep, fatigue, social, emotional, and academic problems, and some syndromes such as ADHD, DCD, and ASD. And now we'll switch over to Shruti Garg for the next slide.
Okay, thank you, Andre. So I'm going to talk about, first start talking about cognition and neuroimaging. So there is an effort internationally amongst research communities and clinicians to really try and understand this cognitive phenotype in NF1. And one of the ways to do that is to look at the MRI images. On the structural imaging, a lot of the studies, something that we're all aware about is these intense lesions known as T2 hyperintensities, or UBOs as they were formerly called. Many researchers have tried to correlate the location and the number of these T2 hyperintensities with the cognition. And what we do know that there's no real clear relationships between the number of these T2 hyperintensities and cognition. However, one study has shown that if these T2 hyperintensities are more diffuse and if they're in the thalamus, then it's associated with worse cognition. Over the course of development, there is some indication that these T2 hyperintensities reduce both in number. We're not clear whether this improvement in these T2 hyperintensities is associated with cognition. Other studies have shown that there's overall increased gray and white matter in NF1, but they've not shown it to be associated with cognitive function. One finding that's been replicated across a number of studies is increased volume of corpus callosum, and this has an inverse relationship with IQ. More recent diffusion MRI studies have shown that there are white matter microstructure changes that are most prominent in the frontal lobe, and these could relate to the difficulties we see in attention executive function. Now, there has, especially over the last 6 or 7 years, an increased emphasis in functional studies. And these would include functional MRI and also magnetic resonance spectroscopy. And these studies have been used to investigate the relationship between brain activation pattern during performance of cognitive tasks. And several of these studies have shown that there's reduced activation of the frontal lobe, particularly of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex during performance of a cognitive task. More recently, MRI or MR spectroscopy studies have shown that there's altered GABAergic neurotransmission, which confirm findings from animal studies. So coming to the behavioral problems in NF1, as already Andre has alluded to many of these, we know that autism and ADHD are really common, but alongside this, developmental coordination disorder is also extremely common. This was referred to motor dyspraxia earlier. The internalizing and externalizing problems are more common in adults with rates of about 50%, but actually they're also very common in children, particularly in adolescents. And the rates that have been reported in recent studies are around 30%. There's higher level of perceived fatigue in children, which has been really shown in a recent study by Vassallo et al. And what I want to emphasize that it's the aggregation of these difficulties, which include cognitive, emotional, social, and motor, which together impacts the quality of life and academic functioning. And when we look at specifically DSM-5 criteria or ICD-11 criteria, many of these children may not fit in one neat box or may not meet the criteria for autism or ADHD, but together they have a contribution of, they have impairments in each of these domains, which together can contribute to actually cause a greater impairment functionally. Not to mention the sleep problems, which are reported extremely commonly and that are seen right from toddlerhood onwards. The basic science studies, particularly in flies, has shown that the neurofibromin protein is required for the calcium cycling in the circadian neurons. And they've shown that the lack of NF1 or neurofibromin disrupts the circadian rhythm. The sleep difficulties commonly reported in parents is difficulties in getting off to sleep, but also waking up too early. We also have to really think about what are the predictors of learning and behavioral problems in NF1. Andre has already told us before that actually when we look at ADHD in NF1, the prevalence of ADHD in males and females with NF1 is similar. And this is different to the population, the non-NF1 population, the general population. However, when we look at autism in NF1, we find there's a male bias, or that males with NF1 are more likely to have a diagnosis of autism than females. And this is a ratio of 4:1. And this is very similar to the general population. When we look at socioeconomic status, we know that families with lower SES or lower socioeconomic status, their children have worse cognitive, behavioral, and academic outcomes. And this is very similar to the general population. Those families where there is a history of NF1 have worse cognitive outcomes even after controlling for SES. And this is a really important finding, really, because, and this correlates with, many of our clinicians' experience, where they find the families with a de novo mutation do much better, or the children do much better academically and functionally. But when there is a family history of NF1, there are worse outcomes. We also know that neurological comorbidities such as hydrocephalus or epilepsy are associated with worse cognitive outcomes. So we now come to the management and treatment of cognitive and behavioral problems in NF1. The general principles for managing cognitive and behavioral problems in NF1 are very similar to what you would do when you have a child without NF1. So for the overall assessment, it is really important to refer the child to a developmental center or developmental pediatrician. There needs to be consideration of underlying learning problems and behavioral difficulties. So understanding that actually social communication and ADHD symptomatology is very commonly seen as and is very commonly comorbid with NF1. And therefore there should be a screening for these difficulties. In terms of management, the very first line of management should be consideration of behavioral approaches, equipping parents with strategies for managing children, behavior modification, and for children, particularly for adolescents, talking treatments, particularly for anxiety disorders. For younger children, there also needs to be interventions for language difficulties and for developmental coordination disorder. For learning difficulties, there could be approaches that are specifically targeted for cognitive remediation. And medication management should also be considered not in itself, but as an adjunct to all the other interventions that I've described above. So in terms of generic interventions, there could be more physiotherapy, occupational therapy, or speech and language therapists. These children might need additional support at school and special education. The remedial training for reading, arithmetic, or writing, and also treatment and for chronic pain, fatigue, or other somatic complaints. When we look at the literature, there have been a few interventions that have been for NF1 specifically, and I provide the references for you to look at. Specifically, there's an intervention for reading that was reported in 2015, but more recently, there has been an emphasis on acceptance and commitment therapy, both for managing anxiety, low mood, but also difficulties with very obvious neurofibromas, facial neurofibromas, and coming to acceptance of the visual differences. There also has been a recent trial of cognitive training using CogMed that was reported in 2017. Andre Rittman, along with Rianne Ostenbrook, are involved in motor training of physical therapies to improve exercise capacity in young children, and that is ongoing. In terms of pharmacological interventions, use of medication should be considered, but it should never be the sole answer. Should also always be as an adjunct to psychological interventions. Andre mentioned before the role of dopamine in NF1, and we know that the cyclic AMP pathway in NF1 is downregulated. So we know that dopamine pathway is affected in NF1. Methylphenidate can be very effective because it works by blocking the activity of dopamine transporters and increasing dopamine level. Clinically, methylphenidate can be very effective in children with NF1. And it can affect both the inattention problems, but also the hyperactivity difficulties. Medicines such as SSRIs or fluoxetine or sertraline can be used for anxiety management in children with NF1. Finally, melatonin can also be helpful, but it should only be considered along with good sleep hygiene advice. And it can be useful for sleep initiation difficulties. Now, Andre mentioned briefly before about experimental treatments. This is a really exciting time for NF1 research, as there have been a number of experimental treatments that have been reported or are in progress that actually try and target underlying molecular pathway. So in this really neat cartoon, what we know that in NF1, there's lack of protein neurofibromin, which upregulates the RAS pathway activity, which downstream increases release of GABA, which then contributes to long-term potentiation and gives rise to the cognitive phenotype. What the statins do, they reduce the functionalization of RAS, downregulate RAS pathway activity, reduce the GABA release at the synaptic junction, and restore the long-term potentiation. So based on this understanding of the action of statins, a number of statin trials have been reported in the literature. Unfortunately, the findings for most of these trials has been that there's been no effect on the primary outcome measures. And the reasons for these are that most of these trials had children in the trials that were in the older age group, or at least in the adolescent age group. And also they relied on really outcome measures that were perhaps insensitive to change, so such as using a generic IQ measure or overall IQ. So as I said, apart from this trial by Stiveros et al., which is from Manchester, where children as young as 4 were included, but it was a really small study where we showed that statins were associated with some changes in neurological markers. But overall, most of the studies have been reported as negative on primary outcome measures. There is, of course, interest in methylphenidate, and actually all the methylphenidate studies suggest that there's actually good impact of methylphenidate on ADHD outcomes. The Excel trial that's being conducted in Holland is still to be published. There is, of course, a real excitement about MEK inhibitors for the treatment of plexiform neurofibromas and low-grade gliomas in NF1. And there is an initial pilot study that was published in last year, which suggested that it may also affect cognition, particularly may have an effect on executive function. However, we have to say that this was only a single arm study rather than an RCT. So, more results are awaited before we know that it definitely has an effect on cognition. In Manchester, we're also trying treatments such as transcranial direct current stimulation. And I know that Holland have tried transmagnetic stimulation. And the rationale for treatment of these is that these sort of treatments can increase cortical excitability.
So are we live, Nicholas?
Yeah, we're live.
Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for attending this masterclass, and welcome to Shruti and Andre. We have a few questions coming up in the chat. Some of them coming actually from patients or parents of patients. We have a question from Ivan Ivanov, who has a son with NF1, who is 21 years old, studying in higher education, speaks 2 foreign languages, and has a very high IQ. How do you explain this? That some NF1 patients do not experience these kind of problems.
No. Shall I take that one, Shruti?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, as I said, when I was discussing intelligence, you also found that the scores in a large group of children and adolescents, they were far from each other. So there are low scores and there are really high scores. And I'm familiar with university students as well having NF1. And this variation is the same as we see in a normal population. And the only difference is that the mean is shifted. So the total distribution of intelligence has gotten a left shift of 10 to 15 points, but that doesn't exclude people to be on the far right side, but they have this really high scores. And next to that, I also want to stress that intelligence and intelligence scores are not the only thing that guarantees your success at school. You also need something like the working attitude, including executive function to organize your study and attention to read big amounts of large amount of text. So this attentional and executive part is also added to the intelligence, and that together also with your social and emotional skills makes your way through education. And if you have 2 or 3 or more of these areas in the plus, so you have some talents there, then you possibly could do higher education, yes. I hope that is an answer to your question, Ivan.
Even says that the case is new for them. They have no other cases in the family. It's a de novo case.
I don't know if that would make a difference. I think there will be familiar cases too with higher IQs. I'm not sure whether that would make a difference. I myself did a study on cognition. I also compared the group of the children with sporadic mutations and familiar mutations, and I didn't find really impressive differences on intelligence and on cognition measures.
Did you want to add something?
Yeah, well, I think that's in generally, our clinical experience, and if you speak to many of the neurologists and geneticists, they seem, they seem to think that the families they see with a new mutation in the family, they tend to do better. And, the reasons behind that, not really understood. But as Andre says, the picture's mixed. So some studies have shown that there's there's some difference, but others have shown that actually there's not much difference in the cognition between the two groups.
I did one study comparing these two groups, and the only difference I found was that the children with the familiar mutation, so with one parent also having NF1, those were the ones that are more coming back more for later follow-up. So that's the group that has been really trying to follow the schedule we set for people with NF1. So we see them at every age. So we see them at 3, 6, 11, 15, and 18 years old, and they always turn up.
So Ivan actually comments that he had nothing, and then he turned out to have an F1 when he was 19 years old. So quite late. We have another series of questions and comments and requests for opinions from the father of an 11-year-old girl who has a tyrosine 489 to cysteine mutations on the NF1 gene and has no tumors, but is diagnosed with ADHD and will be tested for ASD this month. She is on Vyvanse and Strattera to treat the ADHD. And Lars wanted your opinion on, whether on your thoughts on the fact that she's still generally extremely anxious, and when she comes out from school, she's very, very cranky and angry and demanding. and needs adults' attention constantly. And she's completely addicted to iPad, which in a way is calming for her, but in another way is wearing Lars and his family, because they have a very hard time getting her off this. And Lars wanted your opinion on this.
I'll take this one on, Ray. I think what I'm hearing is not uncommon, and this is something that we hear frequently in our clinic. Anxiety is really a core part of autism spectrum disorder. I'm not saying this little girl has it, but it's part of that sort of social immaturity. We find many of these children with NF1 are socially immature, and the anxiety is due to sort of the unfamiliarity and not knowing what's going to happen next. Also, 11 is a really key point of transition from primary to secondary school, and certainly in my experience, it's a really difficult time for children. It's a huge jump. It's from primary to secondary, and it's the time where peer relationships in the world gets a lot more complicated. So it's generally a very difficult time, and I think it's not unheard of for children to come back home and be really cranky and demanding. Our occupational therapist calls it the fizzy pop bottle. It pops when they get home from school. All of these pent up emotions and difficult, things that might upset them during the day, it comes out in the evenings. So, it's hard to give an opinion like this, but all I'd like to say that it really needs a proper evaluation and assessment and an understanding from teachers and everyone around, the parents, the teachers, but everyone in the child's environment, and interventions to help this little girl.
And I'd like to add as well that I think she's lucky to have parents attending these kinds of meetings, firstly, and secondly, being very aware of the different problems that their child has. So they have their eye on her, and they're really looking closely to see what's happening. And anxiety is really a problem that worries a lot of parents. And the good news is that the treatment of anxiety is something you could do quite easily. Also depends, of course, on the origin of the anxiety. For instance, when it's autism, then there will be another treatment necessary than when anxiety stands on itself. And one of the things especially triggered me when you told that she came home cranky from school is that sometimes, especially in the children that are quite proficient in the verbal side of intelligence, so where they can really use difficult words and build longer sentences, then we overestimate the skills of children, and sometimes we ask too much of them, and sometimes we need to turn down the speed of education, and sometimes even some children go to school for shorter periods of time and they come home earlier, and sometimes they take a longer time to complete primary or secondary education, just not to over demand too much and to trigger all these anxieties and possibly also mood problems in these children.
Thank you. We have many questions popping up now. That's how it works. We have a question from Andrea Coppens, who asks, how do you recommend monitoring for motor coordination issues in these patients? Should we have occupational therapists as part of the interdisciplinary teams, or should pediatricians do the monitoring for motor coordination issues?
Yeah. So my understanding is that the motor coordination issues do improve over time, over development. And so, whether to refer to an occupational therapist or not really depends on, how severe, how great functionally impairing that the problems are. I think it's always a good idea if you suspect motor coordination difficulties to refer to an occupational therapist, because they can recommend interventions that can actually be really helpful, especially within the school setting. So if the resources permit, we don't have it in here in Manchester, but we make referrals locally for the children to have occupational therapy input, and they do standardized assessments and offer interventions for children where it's functionally, where the problems of coordination are functionally impairing. And sometimes very simple interventions can be extremely effective, because it's not just the motor coordination that affects the functioning, but also from fatigue, which is a problem that actually makes everything a lot worse. Andrew, do you want to add anything to that? Because you're doing a trial for it as well.
Yes, well, this trial is being conducted by several OTs and PTs in the country, and we're training them to perform this program of 10 to 20 sessions. And we're not quite sure whether this would make a really significant effect, but the point is that after we found that there are more severe motor problems in children, we refer them most of the time to, we have this specialism in physical therapy, which is child physical therapy or occupational therapy. And I do think pediatricians can pick up these signals of motor coordination issues, but the real assessment to see how far behind, for instance, they are in their motor development, that's something up to the OTs and the PTs.
I think that the first observation that I make when I have the child come to my clinic is see how they walk up the stairs. And that's the first thing I notice about them, whether they walk 1 foot at a time or whether they alternate with their feet, and then really ask the parents about, can they use a knife and fork? Can they open a packet of crisps? So it's can they wipe their bottom after going to the toilet? So it's actually, Andre's absolutely right, it can be part of the routine assessment in a pediatrician's office.
Yeah, and there is this really nice screening questionnaire, which is quite short, and you can find that as freeware. I think it's from Barbara Wilson. It's mentioned the DCDQ, so the Developmental Coordination Disorder Questionnaire, which is a questionnaire for parents asking them for the skills, the motor skills of the children they see in everyday life. That's a really nice screening just to decide, also in the pediatrician's office, to find whether or not to refer to OT or PT.
Thank you both. We have many more questions coming up. We have 2 questions regarding treatments being used and potential ones. One from Herb Sarnoff, who asks says that there's a study using N-acetylcysteine in NF1 condition, and he would like to understand the rationale for this. And there's a question from Armel Pindon, if there's any ongoing study to block the 5-HT6 receptor, which is normally modulated by neurofibromine.
So Marco, I didn't hear the first trial because I'm not aware of that.
The first one is on N-acetylcysteine.
Yeah. So I'm actually aware of any trials with N-acetylcysteine, and I don't really know, how the RAS-MAP kinase pathway affects it or how it's related. With the 5-HT, with the HT, did you say the second one was serotonin related?
Yeah, 5-HT6.
Yeah. So again, I'm not aware of any studies really, but I'm sure that I've read a study recently by the Gutman group saying that the serotonin system's affected in NF1, but I really don't know the details of that.
Another question from Sara Brebbia. It seems that recent clinical research of cognitive deficits in NF1 are focused on transcranial direct stimulation, both as an outcome measurement in clinical trials, but also as a treatment. Can you tell more about this and how TMS is connected to the cognitive deficits in NF1?
Yeah. So unfortunately, the last slide on the presentation had some information about this. So I'm sorry that wasn't, we had a little bit of a glitch there. But transmagnetic stimulation is being used as an outcome measure almost. And in Erasmus, actually, in the Netherlands, and there's also been a few studies. So transcranial magnetic stimulation is usually a huge magnetic coil that's placed on the surface of the skull, and a current is given, and they really look at how the brain region that's stimulated affects motor evoked potential. So they measure motor evoked potential in the hand. And it's used so far, it's not being used as a treatment, but so far it's been used as an outcome measure to test whether the medication, in the medication trials, whether the medication's been effective or whether the medication's changed any of those aspects. However, having said that, there is emerging evidence about the use of transmagnetic stimulation for a variety of psychiatric disorders, including depression and eating disorders. But the evidence is still emerging, and it's not routinely used in clinical practice, certainly in the child and adolescent age group. Regarding the second one, the transcranial direct current stimulation, there's a real interest in these therapies using these small amount of electrical currents for the treatment of learning difficulties, and you know, there's a lot of literature emerging, and we are running trials using transcranial direct current stimulation in Manchester, and they're really very much at the experimental stage because we don't understand enough. The rationale for using transcranial direct current stimulation is that it affects local cortical activity. So then the area that is stimulated makes it more likely to makes the neurons more likely to fire. So we have tried to use that because it's very well tolerated. When we studied them, and so this is very much at an experimental stage at the moment. So it's not for clinical practice at all unless we understand a lot more about it.
Andre, did you want to comment on this as well?
No, not really. I thought Shruti addressed this very
yeah, very thoroughly.
No, it was excellent, and I do agree that it is not ready for any therapeutic use, and I also experienced that it is quite hard to perform it. It also takes a long learning trajectory for the people performing the transcranial stimulation, and even if it's for only assessment and to find whether there is difference in the connectivity in the brain. And we do think that there is a really close relation between transcranial stimulation and the and long-term potentiation, which is at its turn really closely related to learning. But we're not quite sure whether this therapeutic use would be effective in neurofibromatosis type 1.
Thank you. There's a comment from Herb Sarnoff regarding the acetylcysteine. Yeah, I can't copy it in your chat on the other side, but he has sent a link to the clinical trial, and maybe we could take that offline and then answer that question separately once you've had the details of that trial. We have another question from Stephen Sherd. Can you speak more about the underlying mechanisms of sleep disruption in NF1 and potential interventions? Would this be related to an increased incidence of chronic fatigue?
Sorry, I didn't understand the first part of the question.
Can you speak more about the underlying mechanisms of sleep disruption in NF1 and the potential interventions?
Yeah.
So do you want me to answer that, Andre, or would you like to?
Well, your slide wasn't sleeping, but I can say just a little bit about it. And one of the things that stood out in a study we did in adolescents and young adults with NF1 is that there was a lot of sleep disruption, but there was a large variety of causes. For instance, especially in the adolescents and young adults, there was a big variation in bedtimes, and they a lot of them had also a very big difference between bedtimes and the weekends and during weekdays, which also in everybody could disturb the rhythm, which would not really facilitate going to sleep at the time that you'd like. So sleep hygiene is obviously really a thing. We also noticed that, of course, the people with ADHD had, as people with ADHD do, had especially problems in getting to sleep, and part of them, as Trudy already said, they could use melatonin to facilitate that starting of the sleep. And we also found that a lot of them that had problems waking up too early or waking up in the middle of the night, those were the people that also had problems with regulation of their mood or anxiety. So there's a really big variety, and I think a thorough assessment is really necessary to find what could be the cause of sleep disruption. And even in some syndromes where we're performing research in that there is a really biological link for this towards the sleeping problems, the sleep hygiene is the first thing that we do as an intervention, and that is really effective in a large part, even if there's a strong biological cause for sleeping problems. Perhaps you want to add to that,
yeah,
Shruti?
just to add in terms of the mechanism that the person was referring to. So I think it's Amita Segal's group. There's a paper published in 2018 which showed that the NF gene controls the brain's perception of day and night time, so the circadian rhythm. And so, the lack of NF1, a lack of neurofibromin, disrupts that. And therefore, because the perception of day and night is disrupted, the sleep problems may be related to that. And so, so we have a kind of natural body clock where we have melatonin rise and fall, and so that's is disrupted. So, and that's what contributes to it, and hence the use of melatonin likely to be helpful, at least for some children, along with the sleep hygiene, as Andre mentioned.
It always kind of far, huh? It always kind of far.
I have a question myself.
The airport? It always kind of far, huh?
And I wondered if you could talk about, you were talking about equipping the parents to actually deal with these issues. And I wondered if you could tell us, how important this is and how this is done in your centers, because I think it's a very, very important thing.
Yes, you're right. Yeah. Well, equipping the parent, we as for now, we don't have a standard program, but we're working on such a program for parents of children with NF1. But
feels a bit of a worrywart.
What we do is having individual couples. And if it's concerning young children, it's most of the time only the parents we speak. But when they get to be 7, 8, or 9 years old, most of the time the children join for part of some of the therapy sessions. We do use all different kinds of techniques, for instance, from acceptance and commitment therapy and from cognitive behavioral therapy, just to deal with the issues we find. As you already heard, there's a large variety of issues that can be addressed with these kinds of parental guidance techniques, and it also depends on what kind of questions parents have. So we have had this kind of generic parental guidance sessions for 1 or 2 sessions with psychoeducation, as we call it. But after that, most of the questions are quite specific and they're different for every child. So in one child, we'll be dealing with the really hyperactive, difficult behavior at home, and for another child, we'll be dealing with learning problems and whether or not to be a kind of substitute teacher as a parent or not. at home. So there's a really big variety, and most of the time we find after these 1 or 2 sessions of generic psychoeducation, we do individual parental guidance for the most parents. So not a standardized program, but a tailor-made program.
Weird. There's always.
I'd just like to add that the CTF has a really nice help sheets on the website, and I always encourage our parents to link up with the charities in their country. So I encourage parents to link up with the charities that we have in the UK. And ask them to go to the resources provided there, and take them to the doctors that they go to. Sometimes the difficulties that are associated with NF1, particularly the neurodevelopmental problems, are not often recognized or attributed. We have this problem in the UK attributed to NF1, saying this is part of NF1 and not really picked up or recognized and treated. So I always ask parents to actually back up what they're saying with up-to-date literature and knowledge, and really use the leaflets that are there on the charity websites. And also contact NF1 centers to advocate on their behalf, because they need, really advocating on the parents' behalf. So in the UK, we have NF1 nurses and some of them via the charity that we have, and so they're a real big advocate for parents.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I know it's coming up to the hour, but there is a good question from Sarah Brebbia, which I think could be answered before we close this session. Do you know if there's a correlation between sleep issues and optic pathway gliomas, as well as cognitive deficits and OPGs?
I'm not aware of a link between the two. Could you think about any link between these two, Shruti?
Well, I mean, I'm not aware of any link between optic. I don't think anyone's looked at, really investigated the relationship between optic pathway glioma and sleep. I'm just sort of thinking, what might be the hypotheses there. And certainly, I mean, where it comes to optic pathway glioma, again, I don't think anyone's really looked at, we did look at sort of brain lesions and the cognition, and I don't really think we saw any relationship with optic pathway glioma and cognitions. I mean, I do know that David Gutman's group showed differences in males and females in optic pathway glioma, those requiring treatment versus those not. But I don't think there was any relationship to cognition as far as I seem to remember.
No, same for me.
Well, thank you very much, Shruti and Andre, for this very lively session, and to the audience for the amazing questions. This webinar has been recorded, and it will be available on the INFA YouTube channel as soon as practicable. So if you want to go back to it, you will receive an email anyway telling you that you can come back to it on the YouTube channel. And the next masterclass is on the 15th of April, completely different subject. It will be on NF2 surgery. And I hope to see many of you there. And I want to thank you all again for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.